within the grand library of human history, few collections of writings have exerted as much enduring power and profound influence as the Bible. It is a work that is not a single book, but a vast tapestry of narratives, poetry, prophecy, and law woven together over millennia. The stories that follow are cornerstones of this tradition, selected from its rich and varied landscape. They are presented not as simple historical records or quaint fables, but as deeply human dramas that explore the timeless and often turbulent relationship between humanity and the divine. In these pages, you will journey into a world of trial and faith, despair and deliverance. You will encounter unlikely heroes, discovering that the hand of providence often chooses the most unassuming individuals for the most extraordinary tasks. A favored son betrayed by his brothers, a fugitive with a stammer called to liberate a nation, a shepherd boy armed only with a sling against a giant, and an exiled statesman whose integrity challenges an empire. You will witness moments when the veil between heaven and earth seems to grow thin, when fire falls from a cloudless sky to consume a waterlogged altar, and when the mouths of ravenous lions are sealed shut by an unseen protector. The collection then turns from the foundational epics of ancient Israel to the pivotal figure at the heart of the Christian faith, Jesus of Nazareth. You will read of his humble, miraculous birth in a world held captive by imperial Rome, an event that whispers of a different kind of power. You will stand with his friends before the cold reality of a tomb and witness a demonstration of authority over death itself that is so staggering it seals his own fate. Finally, you will travel a dusty road to Damascus and behold how the movement's most feared and zealous persecutor is brought to his knees by a blinding light, ultimately being transformed into its most influential champion. Each of these narratives, retold here in contemporary language, explores the enduring questions of the human heart. Why do we suffer? Where do we find courage? What is the nature of faith? How does one respond when called to purpose far greater than oneself? These are the stories that have shaped civilizations, inspired countless works of art, and offered hope and meaning to individuals across generations. They are an invitation to step into a world of epic scope and intimate, personal struggle, a world where ordinary lives are touched by an extraordinary God, the coat of many colors, and a heart of forgiveness. The annals of human history, as recorded in the ancient scriptures, are replete with tales of towering heroes, epic battles, and divine interventions. These narratives, passed down through millennia, offer more than just historical accounts. They are profound allegories of the human condition, exploring the intricate tapestry of faith, frailty, and the unyielding hand of providence. Among these timeless stories, the saga of Joseph, the favored son of Jacob, stands as a particularly poignant and enduring testament to the transformative power of forgiveness in the face of profound betrayal. It is a story that winds its way through the valleys of envy and despair, ascends to the pinnacles of power and prestige, and ultimately finds its resolution in the tender embrace of reconciliation. This is not merely a chronicle of one man's extraordinary journey, but a timeless exploration of the enduring themes of family, jealousy, suffering, and the remarkable capacity of the human heart to heal and forgive. In the sun-drenched land of Canaan, where the patriarch Jacob had settled with his burgeoning family, a seed of discord was sown, watered by the fertile ground of paternal favoritism. Jacob, a man whose life had been a tapestry of struggle and divine encounter, held a special affection for Joseph, the son of his old age, born to him by his most beloved wife, Rachel. This affection was not a subtle thing, a quiet preference whispered in the privacy of their tent. It was a vibrant, visible declaration, embodied in a magnificent coat of many colors, a garment of such exquisite craftsmanship that it set Joseph apart from his 10 older brothers. To them, the coat was not a symbol of their father's love for their younger sibling, but a flagrant banner of his preference, a constant, galling reminder of their own perceived lesser status. The brothers, hardened by years of toiling in the fields, their hands calloused, and their faces weathered by the unforgiving sun, watched Joseph with eyes clouded by a growing storm of resentment. He was a dreamer, a teller of tales that seemed to elevate him above them, to place them in his shadow. He spoke of visions in which their sheaves of grain bowed down to his, and of a celestial tableau where the sun, moon, and 11 stars paid him homage. To the brothers, these were not the innocent fantasies of a youth, but the arrogant pronouncements of a boy who believed himself destined for greatness at their expense. Their jealousy, a bitter root, took hold in their hearts, its tendrils wrapping around their reason, choking the bonds of kinship. The simmering animosity reached its boiling point on a day that began like any other. Jacob, ever doting, sent Joseph to check on his brothers as they tended their flocks near Shechem. From a distance, they saw him approaching, the vibrant hues of his coat a stark slash of color against the muted landscape. In that moment, the venom of their envy overflowed. The sight of him, a walking embodiment of their father's favoritism, ignited a murderous rage within them. "Here comes the dreamer," they sneered, their voices laced with contempt. A dark consensus formed amongst them, a pact sealed in the crucible of their shared resentment. They would silence the dreamer and his dreams, extinguishing the light that so brightly illuminated their own perceived inadequacies. Reuben, the eldest, a man with a flicker of conscience, attempted to temper their fury. He suggested a less final solution: to cast Joseph into a dry well, a pit in the wilderness, intending to return later and rescue him in secret. His words, however, were but a temporary dam against the flood of their hatred. Stripping Joseph of his hated coat, the symbol of their grievance, they cast him into the dark, empty cistern. The echoes of his pleas for mercy were swallowed by the cold, unforgiving earth. As they sat to eat, their hearts hardened against the cries of their own flesh and blood. caravan of Ishmaelite traders appeared on the horizon, their camels laden with spices and perfumes on their way to the distant land of Egypt. In a moment of cruel opportunism, Judah, another of the brothers, proposed a new plan. Why stain their hands with their brother's blood when they could profit from his demise? And so, for the price of 20 pieces of silver, the price of a slave, Joseph was sold into bondage. To conceal their treachery, they dipped the coat of many colors in the blood of a slaughtered goat and presented the tattered, stained garment to their father. The sight of the mangled robe, the tangible evidence of his beloved son's supposed demise, shattered Jacob's world. His grief was a raw, gaping wound, a sorrow so profound that it resisted all attempts at comfort. He tore his clothes, donned sackcloth, and mourned for Joseph, convinced that a wild beast had devoured him. The lie of the brothers had cast a long, dark shadow over the household of Jacob, a shadow that would linger for many years to come. Meanwhile, Joseph, a boy on the cusp of manhood, was carried away from the familiar landscapes of his youth, a prisoner of a fate he could not comprehend. His journey led him to the sprawling, vibrant civilization of Egypt, a land of towering pyramids, majestic temples, and a pantheon of strange gods. There, he was sold to Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. Yet, even in the depths of his despair, a quiet strength, a resilient faith in the God of his fathers, sustained him. He did not succumb to bitterness or rage. Instead, he served his master with diligence and integrity, and a remarkable blessing seemed to follow him. Potiphar saw that everything Joseph touched prospered, and soon entrusted him with the management of his entire household. But the crucible of Joseph's testing was not yet complete. Potiphar's wife, a woman of seductive charm and a restless heart, cast her eyes upon the handsome young Hebrew. She saw in him a forbidden fruit, a temptation to be indulged. Day after day, she attempted to entice him, her words a silken trap. Joseph, steadfast in his loyalty to his master and his God, consistently rebuffed her advances. His refusal, born of a deep-seated sense of righteousness, was met not with respect, but with a woman's scorned fury. In an act of vindictive malice, she falsely accused him of attempted rape, using his hastily discarded cloak as evidence of her fabricated story. Potiphar, enraged by this perceived betrayal, cast Joseph into the royal prison, a place of darkness and despair. Yet, even in this grim, subterranean world, Joseph's character shone through. The keeper of the prison, like Potiphar before him, recognized the young man's inherent goodness and administrative acumen. Before long, Joseph was put in charge of the other prisoners, his days filled with the mundane tasks of managing the affairs of the incarcerated. It was in this unlikely setting that Joseph's gift of interpreting dreams once again came to the fore. Two of Pharaoh's officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, were thrown into the same prison. Each was troubled by a vivid and perplexing dream. With a wisdom that seemed to transcend his years and his circumstances, Joseph interpreted their visions. the cupbearer, he foretold a restoration to his former position in Pharaoh's court. To the baker, he prophesied a grim fate of execution. In a plea tinged with the hope of a forgotten man, Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him when he was restored to his position, to speak a word on his behalf to Pharaoh, and secure his release from his unjust imprisonment. 3 days later, as Joseph had predicted, the cupbearer was restored to his post, and the baker was hanged. But in the heady atmosphere of the royal court, amidst the wine and the feasting, the memory of the young Hebrew in the dungeon faded. The cupbearer, in his restored prosperity, forgot the man who had offered him a glimmer of hope in the darkness. For 2 more long years, Joseph languished in prison, a victim of betrayal and forgotten promises. Then one night, Pharaoh himself was plagued by 2 disturbing dreams that none of his wise men or magicians could decipher. He dreamt of 7 fat, healthy cows being devoured by 7 gaunt, sickly cows, and of 7 plump ears of grain being consumed by 7 withered, blighted ears. The dreams left him deeply unsettled, a sense of foreboding clinging to him like a shroud. It was then that the cupbearer's memory was jolted. He remembered the young Hebrew in the prison, the man who had so accurately interpreted his own dream. Joseph was hastily summoned from the dungeon, his prison rags exchanged for clean linen. Standing before the most powerful man in the known world, he displayed a remarkable humility. He claimed no special power for himself, but attributed his ability to interpret dreams to the one true God. He then proceeded to explain Pharaoh's visions with a clarity and wisdom that astounded the court. The 7 fat cows and plump ears of grain, he explained, represented 7 years of abundant harvest that would soon bless the land of Egypt. But these would be followed by 7 years of devastating famine, a hunger so severe that it would consume all the abundance that had come before. But Joseph did not stop at a mere interpretation. He offered a practical solution, a plan to save Egypt from the impending catastrophe. He advised Pharaoh to appoint a wise and discerning man to oversee the collection and storage of 1/5 of the produce during the years of plenty, creating vast storehouses of grain to be distributed during the years of famine. Pharaoh, a man accustomed to the sycophantic counsel of his courtiers, was struck by the sheer brilliance and foresight of this young Hebrew. He saw in Joseph not just a dreamer, but a man imbued with a divine spirit, a leader of unparalleled wisdom and competence. In a move that defied all convention, Pharaoh elevated Joseph from the status of a forgotten prisoner to that of the 2nd most powerful man in Egypt. He bestowed upon him his own signet ring, clothed him in fine linen, and placed a gold chain around his neck. He gave him a new Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah, and a wife, Asenath, the daughter of a high priest. Joseph, the once betrayed and enslaved boy, was now the vizier of Egypt, entrusted with the very survival of the nation. For 7 years, as Joseph had foretold, the land of Egypt overflowed with abundance. Under his astute administration, vast quantities of grain were collected and stored in granaries in every city. And then, just as he had predicted, the years of plenty gave way to a crippling famine that spread its skeletal fingers not only across Egypt, but across all the surrounding lands, including the land of Canaan. Back in the household of Jacob, the famine took its toll. The patriarch, hearing that there was grain in Egypt, sent his 10 sons on a desperate journey to procure food. Only Benjamin, the youngest, the last precious link to his beloved Rachel, remained behind. When the 10 brothers arrived in Egypt and bowed before the powerful vizier, they did not recognize the man who held their fate in his hands. But Joseph, his heart a tempest of emotions, recognized them immediately. He saw the faces of the men who had sold him into slavery, the men who had shattered his father's heart. A torrent of memories flooded his mind. The vibrant coat, the dark pit, the silver coins. He chose not to reveal his identity immediately. Instead, he spoke to them harshly, accusing them of being spies. He devised a series of tests to gauge their character, to see if the years had softened their hearts, to see if they were capable of the same callousness towards their youngest brother, Benjamin, as they had been towards him. He demanded that they bring Benjamin to him to prove their story, and he kept one of them, Simeon, as a hostage. The brothers returned to their father with the grain, their hearts heavy with fear and confusion. Jacob, already wounded by the loss of Joseph, was distraught at the thought of losing another son. But as the famine worsened, he had no choice but to relent. With a heavy heart, he sent Benjamin with his brothers, along with double the money and a gift for the Egyptian vizier. Upon their return to Egypt, Joseph's resolve began to crumble. The sight of his full brother, Benjamin, the son of his own mother, stirred a deep well of emotion within him. He arranged a feast for them, treating them with a hospitality that both bewildered and frightened them. Then he orchestrated one final dramatic test. He had his silver cup secretly placed in Benjamin's sack of grain. As the brothers began their journey home, they were overtaken by Joseph's steward, who accused them of stealing the vizier's prized possession. The cup was found in Benjamin's sack, and the brothers were brought back before Joseph, their faces ashen with terror. They fell at his feet, offering to become his slaves. But Joseph declared that only the one in whose sack the cup was found would be his slave. It was then that Judah, the very brother who had proposed selling Joseph into slavery so many years ago, stepped forward. In a speech of profound passion and self-sacrifice, he pleaded for Benjamin's release. He spoke of his father's immense love for the boy, of the unbearable grief that would surely kill him if Benjamin did not return. He offered himself as a slave in Benjamin's place, a testament to a heart transformed by remorse and a newfound sense of responsibility. At this display of genuine repentance and selfless love, Joseph could no longer contain himself. He ordered everyone out of the room except for his brothers. And then, through a torrent of tears, he revealed his identity. "I am Joseph," he cried, his voice thick with emotion. "Is my father still alive?" The brothers were stunned into silence, their minds reeling with a mixture of disbelief, fear, and a dawning, incredible hope. The powerful vizier of Egypt, the man who held their lives in his hands, was the brother they had so cruelly wronged. They braced themselves for a well-deserved retribution, for the righteous anger of a man they had left for dead. But Joseph's heart was not filled with vengeance. It was overflowing with a grace that was almost incomprehensible. He saw not the malice of his brothers, but the intricate, mysterious hand of God at work in his life. "Do not be distressed," he told them, his voice gentle and reassuring. "And do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. It was not you who sent me here, but God." In that moment of profound forgiveness, the long, dark shadow of their sin was dispelled by the radiant light of grace. Joseph embraced his brothers, weeping on each of their necks, a tangible expression of his complete and unconditional pardon. He sent them back to Canaan with wagons laden with provisions and a message for their father. "God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay." The news of Joseph's survival was almost too much for Jacob to bear. His heart, so long shrouded in grief, was flooded with a joy that was almost painful in its intensity. He gathered his entire household, all his children and grandchildren, and made the long journey to Egypt. The reunion between the aged patriarch and his long-lost son was a moment of transcendent beauty, a tender embrace that healed the wounds of 2 decades of separation. Joseph settled his family in the fertile land of Goshen, where they prospered and multiplied, becoming a great nation within a nation. He nourished them through the remaining years of the famine, his love and provision a constant testament to the depth of his forgiveness. Even after Jacob's death, the brothers' fear of retribution lingered. They approached Joseph, their hearts still burdened by the weight of their past transgression, and begged for his continued forgiveness. Joseph, his eyes once again filling with tears, reassured them of his unwavering love. "You intended to harm me," he said, his words echoing the central theme of his extraordinary life. "But God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." The story of Joseph is a powerful and enduring testament to the idea that even in the face of the most profound human cruelty, a higher purpose can be at work. It is a story that reminds us that the human heart, though capable of great darkness, is also capable of a forgiveness so profound that it can transform the bitterest of legacies into a legacy of hope and redemption. It is the story of a coat of many colors, a symbol of division and envy that was ultimately replaced by a garment of grace, woven from the threads of suffering, wisdom, and an unwavering faith in the goodness of God. The reluctant prophet and the river of freedom. In the grand and sweeping tapestry of sacred history, there are threads that shimmer with a particular intensity, stories that have shaped the very consciousness of nations and the spiritual landscape of humanity. These are narratives of liberation, of the eternal struggle between oppression and freedom, between the might of earthly empires and the sovereignty of a divine will. Foremost among these is the epic saga of the Exodus, a story that begins in the crucible of slavery and culminates in the thunderous revelation of law and liberty at the foot of a holy mountain. It is the story of a people forged in the furnace of affliction and led to freedom by a most unlikely hero, a man of two worlds, a prince of Egypt and a son of Levi, a murderer and a shepherd who became a prophet. This is the story of Moses, the reluctant deliverer, whose staff would part the seas and whose voice would echo the very words of God, leading his people on a transformative journey from bondage to the dawn of a new covenant. In the land of Goshen, a fertile delta in the heart of the mighty Egyptian empire, the descendants of Jacob had grown from a small clan into a great multitude. The passage of 4 centuries had transformed them from honored guests into a captive nation. A new pharaoh, one who did not know of Joseph and the history of his people's arrival, ascended to the throne. He looked upon the burgeoning Hebrew population not with favor, but with fear. Their numbers were a perceived threat, a potential 5th column within his kingdom. And so, the hand of friendship was withdrawn, and the iron fist of oppression descended. The Hebrews were subjected to brutal forced labor, their days a relentless cycle of toil under the scorching Egyptian sun. They built store cities for Pharaoh, Pithom, and Ramesses, their backs breaking under the weight of mud bricks and the lash of the taskmaster's whip. Yet, the more they were afflicted, the more they multiplied, their resilience a silent defiance against the might of the empire. Pharaoh's fear curdled into a genocidal rage. He issued a chilling decree to the Hebrew midwives, commanding them to kill every male child born to the captive people. But the midwives, women of faith and courage, feared God more than the king and let the boys live. Thwarted, Pharaoh escalated his cruelty, commanding his own people to cast every newborn Hebrew son into the great river Nile, the very lifeblood of Egypt, to become a watery grave. It was into this world of terror and sorrow that a child was born to a man and woman from the tribe of Levi. He was a beautiful child, and his mother, Jochebed, could not bear to obey the Pharaoh's monstrous command. For 3 months, she hid him, her heart a constant knot of terror. When she could hide him no longer, she devised a desperate plan born of a mother's fierce love. She wove a small basket of papyrus reeds, waterproofing it with bitumen and pitch. Placing her infant son inside this tiny ark, she set it afloat among the reeds at the river's edge, entrusting his fate to the currents and the providence of God. His older sister, Miriam, watched from a distance, her young eyes filled with a heavy mixture of hope and fear. As fate, or a more divine hand, would have it, Pharaoh's own daughter came down to the river to bathe. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maidservant to retrieve it. When she opened it, she saw the baby, and he was crying. Her heart was moved with compassion, "This is one of the Hebrew children," she said, her voice soft with pity. In that moment, Miriam, with a courage that belied her years, stepped forward and offered to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. The princess agreed, and Miriam ran to fetch her own mother. And so it was that Jochebed was paid by the princess of Egypt to nurse her own son, a miraculous reprieve in the midst of a national tragedy. When the child was older, he was brought to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. She named him Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." Moses grew up in the splendor of the Egyptian court, educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, a prince in the most powerful empire on earth. Yet, the blood of his people flowed through his veins, a silent undercurrent to his privileged life. One day, when he had grown to manhood, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. He saw an Egyptian taskmaster mercilessly beating a Hebrew slave. A hot, righteous anger surged within him. Seeing that no one was watching, he struck the Egyptian and killed him, burying his body in the sand. He had acted on an impulse of justice, a fierce loyalty to his oppressed kinsmen. The next day, he went out again and saw two Hebrews fighting. He tried to intervene, to be a peacemaker among his own people. But one of them pushed him away, his words a dagger to Moses' heart. "Who made you a prince and a judge over us?" he sneered. "Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" The secret was out. Fear gripped Moses. He knew that if Pharaoh heard of this, his life would be forfeit. He fled from Egypt, a fugitive from the justice of the man who had been his adoptive grandfather. He journeyed east across the harsh, unforgiving Sinai Peninsula into the land of Midian. There, exhausted and alone, he sat down by a well, a displaced prince, a man without a country or a people. He found refuge with a Midianite priest named Jethro, whose 7 daughters he defended from aggressive shepherds at the well. In time, he married one of them, Zipporah, and settled into the quiet, rhythmic life of a shepherd. He had traded the gilded halls of the Egyptian palace for the vast, silent expanse of the wilderness. For 40 years, he led his father-in-law's flocks, the memories of Egypt fading like a distant dream. He was no longer a prince, but a humble shepherd, his hands calloused from his staff, his face weathered by the desert sun. He had found a semblance of peace, a quiet obscurity far from the cries of his enslaved people. But the God of his ancestors had not forgotten his covenant, nor the suffering of his people. One day, as Moses was tending his flock near Horeb, the mountain of God, he saw a sight that arrested his attention. A bush was ablaze with fire, yet it was not consumed. Its leaves, though licked by flames, remained green and vibrant. Drawn by curiosity, he turned aside to see this great sight. As he approached, a voice called to him from within the bush, a voice that was both terrifying and majestic. "Moses, Moses." "Here I am," he answered, his voice trembling. "Do not come any closer," the voice commanded. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Then the voice declared, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. The voice continued, speaking of the affliction of the Israelites in Egypt, of their cries that had reached the heavens. And then came the call, the commission that would shatter Moses's quiet life and set him on a path of unimaginable consequence. "So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people the Israelites out of Egypt." Moses was stunned, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task. He was a shepherd, a fugitive, a man with a stammering tongue. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" he stammered, his old insecurities rushing back. God's answer was not a list of Moses's qualifications, but a simple, powerful promise. "I will be with you." Still, Moses hesitated, raising a series of objections. "What if they ask your name?" God revealed his sacred name. "I am who I am," a declaration of eternal, self-existent being. "What if they don't believe me?" God gave him 3 miraculous signs. His staff would become a snake, his hand would become leprous and then clean again, and the water from the Nile would turn to blood. "I am not eloquent, I am slow of speech and tongue." God reminded him who made the mouth, who gives sight and hearing. Finally, in a plea of desperation, Moses begged, "Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else." God's anger was kindled at Moses's persistent reluctance, yet he showed grace. He appointed Moses's brother, Aaron, to be his spokesman, his prophet. And so, the reluctant shepherd, armed with his staff and the promise of God's presence, returned to the land of his birth, to the heart of the empire he had fled 40 years earlier, to confront the most powerful man on earth. The confrontation with Pharaoh was a battle of wills, a dramatic clash between the God-king of Egypt and the unseen God of the Hebrews. Moses and Aaron stood before the throne and delivered their message. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go." Pharaoh's response was one of arrogant defiance. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." He not only refused their request, but increased the Israelites' burdens, forcing them to gather their own straw for the bricks, yet still demanding the same quota. The people's suffering intensified, and they cried out against Moses and Aaron. Moses, his own faith faltering, cried out to God. In response, God unleashed a series of 10 devastating plagues upon the land of Egypt, a systematic assault on the pantheon of Egyptian gods, and a demonstration of his supreme power. The Nile, the source of life, turned to blood. Swarms of frogs, gnats, and flies descended upon the land. A pestilence struck the livestock. Boils afflicted the people. A terrifying hailstorm, mixed with fire, rained down from the sky. A swarm of locusts devoured every green thing. A palpable darkness, a darkness that could be felt, covered the land for 3 days. With each plague, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, his pride refusing to yield. Finally, God announced the 10th and most terrible plague, the death of every firstborn son in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh on his throne to the firstborn of the captive in the dungeon. But for the Israelites, God provided a means of deliverance. This was the night of the Passover. Each family was to take a lamb without blemish, slaughter it, and paint its blood on the doorposts and lintel of their home. They were to roast the lamb and eat it in haste, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, their cloaks tucked in, their sandals on their feet, their staffs in hand, ready for a journey. For on that night, the angel of death would pass through the land of Egypt, and when he saw the blood, he would pass over that house, and the firstborn within would be spared. At midnight, a great cry went up throughout Egypt, a cry of anguish and despair, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Pharaoh, his own son now dead, finally broke. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the dead of night and begged them to leave, to take their people, their flocks, their herds, everything, and go. The Egyptians, desperate to be rid of the Israelites, urged them to leave quickly, lavishing them with silver and gold, a final, ironic payment for centuries of unpaid labor. And so, after 430 years of bondage, the nation of Israel marched out of Egypt, a vast multitude of men, women, and children, their departure not a secret escape, but a triumphant exodus. God did not lead them by the direct route through Philistine territory, but by way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. He went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light. But Pharaoh's hardened heart had one last flicker of defiance. Regretting his decision, he mustered his army, his chariots, and his horsemen, and pursued the Israelites, trapping them between the desert and the sea. The Israelites, seeing the approaching Egyptian army, were terrified. They cried out to Moses, their newfound freedom already seeming like a cruel mirage. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? Moses, his own faith now forged in the crucible of divine encounter, stood before the panicked crowd and declared, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." At God's command, Moses raised his staff and stretched out his hand over the sea. A great east wind blew all night, and the waters of the Red Sea were divided, piling up like walls on either side, creating a path of dry land through the heart of the sea. The Israelites walked through on dry ground, the pillar of cloud and fire protecting their rear. The Egyptians, in their blind fury, pursued them into the seabed. But once the last Israelite had reached the other side, Moses stretched out his hand again. The waters returned to their place, crashing down upon the Egyptian army, swallowing their chariots and their horsemen. The mighty army of Pharaoh was utterly destroyed. As the morning sun rose, the Israelites saw the bodies of their former masters washed up on the shore. The fear was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of awe and gratitude. They had witnessed the ultimate triumph of their God over the mightiest empire on earth. Miriam, the sister who had watched over the baby in the basket, now a prophetess in her own right, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women followed her, with tambourines and dancing. And Miriam sang to them Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. The river that was meant to be a grave for their children had become, through the parted waters of the Red Sea, a pathway to freedom, and the song of a liberated people echoed across the shores of a new beginning. The shepherd's stone and the giant's fall. Throughout the chronicles of human conflict, there are moments that transcend the simple recording of battle. They become archetypes, enduring symbols of a struggle that is not merely physical, but spiritual. These are the tales where the seemingly insurmountable is overcome, where courage is found in the most unassuming of hearts, and where faith becomes a weapon more potent than bronze or iron. The story of David and Goliath is chief among these resonant narratives. It is a story etched into the world's consciousness, a timeless testament to the idea that the size of one's adversary is no match for the depth of one's conviction. Set against the backdrop of a sun-scorched valley, it is the ultimate underdog story, a dramatic duel that pitted a boy shepherd against a giant champion, a simple sling against a warrior's spear, and a nation's fear against one young man's audacious trust in his God. In the valley of Elah, where the rolling hills of Judah flattened into a wide, dusty basin, two great armies stood poised for war. On one ridge, arrayed in ordered ranks, was the army of Israel, led by their first king, Saul. A palpable tension hung over their camp, a mixture of duty and a deep, gnawing fear. On the opposite ridge stood the Philistines, the perennial tormentors of Israel, their iron weapons and chariots a stark symbol of their military might. But their greatest weapon, the source of Israel's paralysis, was not a piece of technology, but a man. His name was Goliath, and he was a giant, not just in stature, but in menace. Hailing from the city of Gath, he stood over 9 feet tall, a mountain of muscle and bronze. His armor was a terrifying spectacle in itself. A bronze helmet on his head, a coat of scale mail that weighed over 100 pounds, bronze greaves on his legs, and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, its iron point alone weighing more than a man's shield. Every morning and every evening, for 40 agonizing days, Goliath would stride into the valley, his armor-bearer marching before him, his voice a thunderous boom that echoed off the hillsides. "Why do you come out and line up for battle?" he would roar, his words dripping with contempt. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." He would then issue his taunt, a challenge that struck at the very heart of Israel's honor. "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man, and let us fight each other." At his words, a wave of despair would wash over the Israelite camp. King Saul, himself a man of great height and presence, was dismayed and terrified. His soldiers, seasoned warriors, looked at the giant champion, and their courage evaporated like mist in the desert sun. For 40 days, the rhythm of life in the valley was dictated by this ritual of fear. The sun would rise, Goliath would issue his challenge, and the army of Israel would shrink back in shame and terror. The stalemate was not one of military strategy, but of sheer intimidation. Miles away, in the quiet pastures surrounding the village of Bethlehem, a young man named David was tending his father's sheep. He was the youngest of 8 sons of Jesse, a youth with a ruddy complexion and a vibrant spirit. While his 3 eldest brothers stood in the ranks of Saul's army, David's world was one of meadows and streams, of protecting his flock from the threats of the wild. He knew the weight of a shepherd's staff and the satisfying thrum of a stone released from his sling, a skill honed through countless hours of practice against the predators of the wilderness, the lion and the bear. One day, his elderly father, Jesse, called him from the fields. He tasked David with a simple errand: to take provisions of roasted grain and bread to his brothers in the army, and a gift of cheese to their commander. He was also to see how his brothers were faring and bring back some token of their well-being. David rose early the next morning, left the flock with another shepherd, and set off for the valley of Elah, his heart filled with a mixture of familial duty and youthful curiosity. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. But the defiant shouts quickly died in their throats, for at that moment, Goliath of Gath stepped out from the Philistine lines and began his daily tirade of taunts. David, standing amongst the supply wagons, heard the giant's defiant words and saw the reaction of the Israelite soldiers. He watched in disbelief as these grown men, these warriors of God, fled in great fear. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David asked the men standing near him, his voice a stark contrast to the fear-laden whispers around him. His question was not born of youthful arrogance, but of a deep, unshakable faith. He saw the situation not as a contest between a giant and a man, but between a blasphemous pagan and the honor of the God of Israel. His eldest brother, Eliab, overheard him. Filled with an older sibling's irritation and perhaps a twinge of shame, he rebuked David sharply. "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." David, unperturbed by his brother's anger, simply replied, "Now what have I done? Can't I even speak?" He turned away and continued asking his question, his spirit unquenched. His words, so full of a faith that was absent in the rest of the camp, were soon reported to King Saul, who sent for him. David stood before the king, a mere boy in the presence of the anointed ruler, yet he spoke with an authority that belied his years. "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine," he declared. "Your servant will go and fight him." Saul looked at the young shepherd, at his youth and his lack of armor, and shook his head. "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David had a different kind of resume, a record of battles fought not on the fields of men, but in the wilderness against the raw fury of nature. Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep, he explained. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul, moved by this simple yet profound declaration of faith, finally relented. Go, he said, and the Lord be with you. The king then tried to equip David for the battle, clothing him in his own tunic, putting a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword and tried to walk, but he was encumbered by the unfamiliar weight. This was not his way of fighting. I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I am not used to them. So he took them off. Instead, he walked to the nearby stream that snaked through the valley floor. He reached down and selected 5 smooth stones, polished by the endless flow of water, and placed them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag. With his staff in one hand and his sling in the other, he walked out into the open valley to meet the Philistine champion. Goliath, seeing the approaching figure, began to walk toward him, his armor-bearer in front with his great shield. He squinted, his eyes focusing on his challenger. He saw not a mighty warrior, but a boy, ruddy and handsome. The sight filled him with contemptuous rage. It was an insult to his martial pride. Am I a dog, he bellowed, that you come at me with sticks? And he cursed David by his Philistine gods. Come here, Goliath roared, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. David, undaunted, shouted back, his voice ringing with a clarity and power that cut through the giant's bluster. You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord, and he will give all of you into our hands. As Goliath moved closer to attack, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag, he took out a stone, placed it in his sling, and began to whirl it around his head. The sling blurred into a circle, the hum of the stone cutting through the tense silence of the valley. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he released it. The stone flew straight and true, a tiny missile against a giant target. It struck the Philistine on his forehead, on the one small patch of exposed skin below his helmet. The stone sank into his forehead, and the giant staggered. A look of stunned surprise crossed his face before his eyes rolled back in his head. He crumpled and fell face down on the ground, the crash of his armor echoing through the valley. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Both armies watched, motionless, in utter disbelief. David then ran and stood over the fallen giant. As Goliath had no sword of his own, David drew the giant's massive sword from its sheath. With a strength born of divine empowerment, he raised the heavy blade and cut off Goliath's head. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. The spell of fear was broken. A great shout of victory erupted from the Israelite ranks, and they surged forward, pursuing the panicked Philistines all the way to the gates of Gath and Ekron. The Valley of Elah, so long a place of shame and paralysis, became a scene of triumphant victory. David took the Philistines' head to Jerusalem and put the giant's weapons in his own tent. The shepherd boy from Bethlehem had done more than kill a giant. He had reminded a nation of its identity and its source of strength. He had demonstrated that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in the face of it, fueled by a faith that sees beyond the visible. The victory was not won by armor or by a sword, but by a shepherd's stone and a heart that trusted in the living God. In the quiet that followed the battle, as a new chapter began for David and for all of Israel, the lesson of the Valley of Elah would echo for generations. The greatest of giants can fall, and sometimes the most unassuming of hands are chosen to cast the stone. The faith of a statesman and the mouths of lions. In the annals of faith, there are moments of quiet defiance that roar louder than any battle cry. These are the instances when a single soul, armed with nothing but conviction, stands against the full force of a worldly empire. The story of Daniel in the lion's den is such a moment. It is a narrative that unfolds not on a sprawling battlefield, but in the gilded corridors of power and the hushed intimacy of a prayer chamber. It is a testament to unwavering integrity in a world of conspiracy and compromise, a dramatic account of how steadfast devotion can face the most terrifying of fates and emerge not only unscathed, but triumphant. This is the story of a venerable statesman whose loyalty to his God was deemed a political threat, and of a night spent in the company of ravenous beasts, where the only true power present was not the law of kings or the teeth of lions, but the unshakable presence of the divine. The vast Babylonian Empire had fallen, its golden age extinguished by the conquering armies of the Medes and Persians. A new order was established under Darius the Mede, a monarch who now presided over a sprawling, diverse kingdom. To manage this immense realm, Darius implemented a structure of governance, appointing 120 satraps, or provincial governors, to rule over the various districts. Above these satraps, he appointed 3 administrators to whom they would report, ensuring the efficient management of the empire and the protection of the king's interests. One of these 3 administrators was Daniel. This was the same Daniel who, as a young man, had been exiled from his homeland of Judah decades earlier. He had served kings before Darius, interpreting dreams, and deciphering cryptic messages with a wisdom that was clearly not his own. Now, in the winter of his life, his integrity and exceptional qualities shone as brightly as ever. He so distinguished himself among the administrators and satraps with his astute mind and flawless character that King Darius planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Daniel, the Hebrew exile, was poised to become the second most powerful man in the empire, but prominence in the courts of kings is a precarious thing. It breeds envy as surely as stagnant water breeds mosquitoes. The other administrators and the satraps watched Daniel's ascent with eyes jaundiced by jealousy. They saw his favor with the king, his incorruptible nature, and his refusal to engage in the casual corruption that was common in their circles. His very goodness was a rebuke to their own ambition and greed. They saw him not as a colleague to be admired, but as an obstacle to be removed. And so, a conspiracy was born in the shadowed corners of the palace. The cabal of officials began to search for some grounds for a charge against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. They scrutinized his ledgers, interrogated his subordinates, and reviewed his judgments, hoping to find some evidence of negligence or corruption. But their search was fruitless. Daniel was faultless. He was trustworthy, and neither corrupt nor negligent in any of his duties. His record was as clean as polished silver. Frustrated, the conspirators came to a cynical realization. We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel, they conferred amongst themselves, unless it has something to do with the law of his God. They knew Daniel's most defining characteristic, his unwavering, thrice daily devotion to the God of Israel. His faith was not a private, hidden thing. It was the very rhythm of his life, as constant as the rising and setting of the sun. In his greatest strength, they saw his only vulnerability. With their malevolent strategy decided, the group of administrators and satraps went as a group to King Darius. They approached him with fawning deference, their true intentions hidden behind masks of loyalty. May King Darius live forever, they began. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that for the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. They framed their proposal as an act of ultimate fealty to the king, a month-long celebration of his supreme authority over the empire. To give it the weight of permanence and power, they added a crucial clause. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. King Darius, flattered by this grand gesture of loyalty, and seeing no apparent harm in it, fell into their trap. He saw it as a political maneuver to unify the diverse peoples of his empire under his authority. He did not perceive the venomous intent that lay coiled beneath the surface of their proposal. And so, without consulting his most trusted administrator, Daniel, he signed the decree into law. The ink dried, and the trap was set. decree had been published, his response was one of quiet, courageous consistency. He did not panic. He did not protest. He did not alter his routine to pray in secret. He simply went home to his upstairs room, where the windows opened toward Jerusalem, the city of his heart and his heritage. And there, just as he had done every day for decades, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God. 3 times that day, he did this. His act was not one of public defiance meant to provoke, but one of private devotion that he would not compromise, even under threat of a horrific death. His loyalty to God was not subject to the shifting whims of earthly kings. This was precisely what his enemies had been waiting for. They went as a group to Daniel's house and found him praying and asking God for help. His posture of supplication, a clear violation of the king's new, unalterable law. They had their evidence. They hurried back to the king, their voices laced with malicious glee. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king, still oblivious to their plot, confirmed it. The decree stands, he said, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they played their trump card. Daniel, they announced, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, the full horror of the situation dawned on him. He was deeply distressed. The trap had not been for Daniel alone. It had been for him as well. He had been manipulated, his vanity used as a weapon against his most faithful and valued servant. He realized with sickening clarity that he had been a pawn in their petty, jealous game. From that moment until sunset, the king worked tirelessly to rescue Daniel. He summoned his legal experts, searching for any loophole, any precedent that might allow him to override his own unchangeable law. But the law of the Medes and Persians was absolute. Not even the king who signed it could annul it. His conspiratorial officials, sensing his desire to save Daniel, pressed their advantage. They came to him again, reminding him, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." His heart heavy with regret and a profound sense of helplessness, King Darius gave the order. Daniel was arrested and brought to the mouth of the lion's den. The king, his voice thick with sorrow, spoke to his condemned friend. "May your God, whom you serve so continually, rescue you." Daniel was cast into the den, a dark, cavernous pit where the musky scent of predator and the low, rumbling growls of hungry lions filled the air. A large stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation could not be changed. The sentence was final, sealed in both law and stone. That night, there was no peace in the royal palace. King Darius returned to his chambers, but refused all food and entertainment. He could not sleep, his mind tormented by the image of his faithful servant at the mercy of the ravenous beasts. He spent the night fasting and packing, his royal power a mockery in the face of his personal grief and regret. He had condemned an innocent man, and the weight of it crushed his spirit. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. His heart pounded with a mixture of desperate hope and dreadful certainty. As he approached, he called out in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" A moment of agonizing silence hung in the cool morning air. Then a voice answered from the depths of the pit, calm and clear. "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees washed over him. He gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was brought up, not a single scratch was found on him, not a wound, not a tear in his robe. He was completely unharmed because he had trusted in his God. The king's relief quickly hardened into a righteous fury. The same law that had condemned the innocent would now be used to punish the guilty. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were arrested, and they, along with their wives and their children, in a brutal but common custom of the time, were thrown into the lion's den. Before they even reached the floor of the pit, the lions, their mouths now miraculously opened, overpowered them and crushed all their bones. The beast's inaction toward Daniel was not due to a lack of hunger, but to a divine intervention that had now been lifted. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth. But this time, the decree was vastly different. "I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." And so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus, the Persian who followed. His night in the den of lions became a legendary testament to his faith, a story that would be told for millennia. It was a powerful demonstration that integrity of heart and faithfulness to God are a shield more powerful than any royal decree, a force that can silence the mouths of lions and turn the heart of kings, the humility of heaven, and the dawn of hope. History is often measured by the rise and fall of empires, the clash of armies, and the edicts of powerful kings. Yet, some of the most profound turning points in the human story arrive not with a conqueror's roar, but with a newborn's cry. The story of the Nativity is the ultimate embodiment of this truth, a narrative where cosmic significance is wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid in a feeding trough. It is a story that begins in the quiet Galilean hills and resonates through the halls of power in Rome and Jerusalem. A tale of seemingly ordinary people caught in the sweep of an extraordinary divine plan. This is the account of how eternity intersected with time, how the infinite God chose to enter his creation not as a thundering judge or a mighty warrior, but as a helpless infant, bringing a new and living hope into a world weary with waiting. The world was held in the grip of Rome. From the misty shores of Britannia to the sun-scorched sands of Mesopotamia, the will of one man, Caesar Augustus, was law. It was an age of enforced peace, the Pax Romana, a peace kept by the iron fist of the legions. In the small, often overlooked province of Judea, a client king named Herod the Great ruled with a blend of magnificent building projects and paranoid brutality. The Jewish people, inheritors of ancient prophecies, longed for a Messiah, a promised deliverer who would break the yoke of foreign oppression and restore the glory of their nation. They looked for a king, a general, a political revolutionary. They were not looking at a teenage girl in the sleepy Galilean village of Nazareth. Her name was Mary. She was a young woman, likely no more than 15 or 16, betrothed to a local carpenter named Joseph, a man of quiet integrity and a descendant of the great King David. Her life was one of humble routine, her future seemingly mapped out in the familiar patterns of village life: marriage, home, children. But the God of her fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, had a different plan, one that would irrevocably alter her life and the course of human history. One day, as she went about her daily tasks, the mundane fabric of her reality was torn by a visitor from beyond the veil of the world. An angel, Gabriel, the same who had stood in the presence of God, appeared before her. A radiant light filled the small room, and Mary was deeply troubled, her heart pounding with a mixture of awe and fear. "Greetings, you who are highly favored," the angel declared. "The Lord is with you." Confused by his words, she tried to understand what this extraordinary greeting might mean. The angel, sensing her apprehension, spoke gently. "Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end." Mary, a virgin betrothed, but not yet married, asked the question that hung in the air, a question of simple human biology. "How will this be?" she asked, "since I am a virgin?" Gabriel answered, explaining that this would not be a birth of ordinary human will, but of divine power. "The Holy Spirit will come on you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God." To bolster her faith, the angel gave her a sign. Her relative Elizabeth, a woman thought to be barren and now well advanced in years, was already 6 months pregnant with a son. For, as Gabriel concluded, no word from God will ever fail. In that moment, faced with a destiny that was both terrifying and glorious, Mary uttered the words that would become a model of faith for all generations. With a heart surrendered to the divine will, she replied, "I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled." And with that, the angel left her. Her fiancé, Joseph, was a righteous man, a man who lived his life in accordance with the law and his conscience. When he learned of Mary's pregnancy, his world was turned upside down. The law was clear, the social consequences severe. A public accusation of adultery could lead to disgrace and even stoning. Yet, his righteousness was tempered with a deep and genuine kindness. He could not bear the thought of exposing Mary to public shame. He resolved to divorce her quietly, to absorb the pain and confusion himself in an act of quiet compassion. But as he considered this, he too received a message that transcended the ordinary. An angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, speaking into the turmoil of his heart. "Joseph, son of David," the angel said, "do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." The angel's message connected the present moment to the ancient prophecies. All this, the angel explained, was the fulfillment of the words spoken by the prophet Isaiah centuries before. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, a name which means God with us. When Joseph woke up, the fear and doubt had been replaced by a quiet resolve. He did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him, and took Mary home as his wife, becoming the earthly father and protector of the Son of God. In those days, a decree went out from the distant imperial capital of Rome. Caesar Augustus, in his desire to organize and tax his vast empire, ordered that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. Everyone was to return to their own ancestral town to register. This imperial edict, an act of a pagan emperor concerned with power and wealth, became the unlikely instrument of divine prophecy. For the ancient scriptures had foretold that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, the small town of David. Joseph, being of the house and line of David, had no choice but to obey. He and Mary set out from their home in Nazareth on the arduous journey south. It was a trek of some 90 miles, a difficult passage over rugged hills and dusty roads, made all the more challenging by Mary's advanced pregnancy. They traveled not with a royal retinue, but likely with a simple donkey and the meager provisions they could carry. When they finally arrived in Bethlehem, the town was teeming with people. Thousands of others, also of David's lineage, had converged on the small town to register for the census. Every inn, every guest room, every corner of hospitality was occupied. There was no welcome for the young couple from Nazareth, no place for them to rest after their long journey. There was no room for them in the inn. They found refuge in the humblest of shelters, a stable carved into the limestone hillside, a place meant not for people, but for animals. And there, amidst the lowing of oxen and the bleating of sheep, in the quiet humility of a place smelling of hay and earth, the time came for the baby to be born. Mary brought forth her firstborn son. She wrapped him in strips of cloth, swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, a feeding trough for the animals. The King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the Word made flesh, had entered the world not in a palace, but in a stable. Heaven's great humility was now manifest on earth. On the hillsides outside the town, in the deep darkness of the night, a group of shepherds were keeping watch over their flocks. Theirs was a lowly profession. Their lives lived on the margins of society. They were simple, rugged men, accustomed to the silence of the night sky, broken only by the sounds of their sheep. Suddenly, their familiar world was shattered by a celestial light. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, bathing the dark hills in an unearthly radiance. They were terrified. "Do not be afraid," the angel said, his voice a beacon in their fear. "I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord." The angel then gave them a sign of profound paradox and humility. "You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." And then, in an instant, the lone angel was joined by a vast multitude of the heavenly host, a great army of angels, praising God and filling the night with their joyous proclamation. "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace to those on whom his favor rests." As quickly as it appeared, the celestial vision was gone, leaving the shepherds in the sudden, profound silence of the night, their hearts still racing with the wonder of what they had seen and heard. They looked at one another, their faces illuminated by the starlight. "Let's go to Bethlehem," they said, "and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about." They hurried off, leaving their flocks, and found their way to the stable. There they saw Mary and Joseph and the baby, who was lying in the manger, just as the angel had told them. After they had seen him, they spread the word concerning what had been told them about this child, and all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said. The humble shepherds, the outcasts, had become the first evangelists, the first to proclaim the good news of the Savior's birth. Mary, for her part, treasured up all these things, the angelic visitations, the words of the shepherds, and pondered them in her heart. Meanwhile, far to the east, in a land of ancient wisdom and celestial observation, a group of men known as Magi had also seen a sign. They were scholars, likely Persian or Arabian astrologers, who studied the stars for meaning. They had seen a new star in the heavens, a star whose appearance they interpreted as heralding the birth of a new king of the Jews. Driven by a desire to pay homage to this newborn king, they embarked on a long and perilous journey, following the star westward. Their journey eventually led them to Jerusalem, the capital city, the logical place to inquire about a newborn king. "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews?" they asked. "We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Their question sent a ripple of alarm through the city and into the paranoid heart of King Herod. The news of a potential rival, a newborn claimant to his throne, terrified him. He gathered his chief priests and teachers of the law and questioned them as to where the Messiah was to be born. They consulted the ancient scrolls and gave him the answer from the prophet Micah. In Bethlehem, in Judea. Herod then called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem with cunning instructions. Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him. His words were a cloak of piety, hiding a murderous intent. As the Magi continued their journey, the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them, until it stopped over the very place where the child was. They were overjoyed. On coming to the house, for by now Joseph and Mary had found more suitable lodging, they saw the child with his mother Mary. They bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of profound symbolic meaning. Gold, the gift for a king; frankincense, the incense used in the worship of a deity; and myrrh, a fragrant resin used for anointing and embalming, a foreshadowing of his future suffering and death. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route, their quest fulfilled, their lives forever changed by their encounter with the infant king. The dawn of a new age had arrived, not with the pomp and power the world expected, but in the vulnerable cry of a baby in a manger, a quiet promise of hope for all humanity. The prophet of fire and the silence of idols. In the turbulent history of ancient Israel, there were ages when the soul of the nation seemed to hang in the balance. The covenant made in the Sinai wilderness, the pledge to worship the one true God, would grow faint in the people's memory, replaced by the seductive allure of pagan gods. This is the story of such a time, a dark chapter when the kingdom of Israel was plunged into a famine, not only of bread and water, but of faith itself. It is a tale dominated by a corrupt king, a ruthless queen, and a lone, fiery prophet who stood against the tide of apostasy. It is the dramatic account of a spectacular showdown on a mountain summit, a divine contest between the silent, impotent idols of wood and stone and the living God who answers by fire. The northern kingdom of Israel languished under the rule of King Ahab, a man who, more than any king before him, did evil in the eyes of the Lord. His weakness and moral drift were cemented by his marriage to Jezebel, a Phoenician princess and a fanatical worshipper of the storm god Baal. With Jezebel as queen, the worship of Baal became the state religion. The altars of the Lord were torn down. His prophets were systematically hunted and slaughtered, and the land was filled with the opulent temples and idolatrous rites of Baal and his consort, Asherah. The nation's spiritual compass was broken, pointing away from the God who had delivered them from Egypt and toward the lifeless gods of their neighbors. Into this spiritual wasteland strode a man who seemed to be forged from the very wilderness he inhabited. His name was Elijah the Tishbite. clad in a garment of hair and a leather belt. He was a figure of raw, uncompromising power. He appeared before the corrupt King Ahab with a startling proclamation, a divine judgment upon the land's infidelity. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, he declared, his eyes blazing, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word. Having delivered his message, he vanished as abruptly as he had appeared, retreating to the wilderness to be sustained by God's own hand, first by ravens and later by the miraculous provision of a widow in a foreign land. For 3.5 years, the skies over Israel remained a cloudless, metallic dome. The earth grew cracked and barren. The streams and rivers dried up, and a devastating famine gripped the kingdom. The green hills of Samaria turned brown and dusty. The people and their livestock suffered terribly. The golden statues of Baal, the supposed god of rain and fertility, stood silent and impotent under the relentless sun. The drought was a stark, physical manifestation of the spiritual barrenness of the land. During this time, Ahab and his queen, Jezebel, scoured the kingdom for Elijah, blaming the prophet for the calamity that had befallen them. But it was God's own timing that brought the confrontation to a head. The word of the Lord came to Elijah. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. Elijah set out. On his way, he met Obadiah, the administrator of Ahab's palace. Obadiah was a devout believer who secretly revered the Lord, having hidden 100 of the Lord's prophets in caves to save them from Jezebel's murderous purge. He was now on a desperate mission from Ahab to find grass to keep the royal horses and mules alive. When Obadiah saw Elijah, he fell on his face in reverence and fear. Elijah commanded him, "Go, tell your master, Elijah is here." Obadiah was terrified. To announce Elijah's presence to the volatile king was to risk his own life. But Elijah assured him he would present himself to Ahab that very day. The meeting, when it happened, was electric with tension. "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" Ahab sneered, his voice dripping with accusation. Elijah's response was like a thunderclap, fearless and direct. "I have not made trouble for Israel," he retorted, "but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals." Then Elijah laid down the terms for a definitive, public showdown. He issued a challenge that Ahab, desperate for a solution to the drought, could not refuse. "Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." The stage was set. Mount Carmel, a lush mountain range overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, was to be the theater for a divine contest. Ahab sent word throughout the kingdom, and the people, along with the prophets of Baal, gathered at the appointed place. The air was thick with anticipation. Elijah strode before the assembly, his lone figure a stark contrast to the richly robed ranks of Baal's priesthood. He posed a sharp, piercing question to the wavering populace. "How long will you waver between two opinions?" He cried, his voice echoing across the mountainside. If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. The people stood in silence, their hearts convicted by his words, yet too fearful or uncertain to respond. Elijah continued, laying out the rules of the contest. I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is God. The people, intrigued by the stark and dramatic proposal, answered in one voice, What you say is good. Elijah turned to the prophets of Baal. Choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. They took the bull, prepared it, and placed it upon their altar. From morning until noon, they called on the name of Baal. Baal, answer us, they cried, their voices rising in a frantic chorus. They performed a bizarre, limping dance around the altar they had made. But there was no response. The sky remained silent. The only sound was the wind rustling through the dry grass and their own desperate chanting. At noon, Elijah began to mock them, his words laced with a sharp, biting sarcasm. Shout louder, he taunted. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. Goaded by his mockery and growing more desperate, the prophets of Baal worked themselves into a frenzy. They shouted louder and, according to their gruesome custom, began to slash themselves with swords and spears until their blood flowed freely. They raved and prophesied until the time for the evening sacrifice. But still, there was no voice, no answer, no sign that anyone was listening. Their God was silent. The sky was empty. Their efforts were a chaotic and bloody spectacle of utter futility. Then Elijah said to all the people, Come here to me. They gathered around him as he began to repair the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, and with them he rebuilt the altar in the name of the Lord. His actions were deliberate, methodical, a quiet reconstruction of true worship in the face of pagan chaos. He dug a trench around the altar large enough to hold about 15 liters of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then, to make the coming miracle utterly undeniable, to remove any possibility of trickery, he gave a staggering command. Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. They did so. Do it again, he said, and they did it again. Do it a 3rd time, he ordered, and for a 3rd time they drenched the sacrifice. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. The offering was a sodden, dripping mess. By any natural means, it was impossible to burn. With all eyes upon him, Elijah stepped forward. He did not shout or dance or cut himself. He simply prayed. His prayer was one of beautiful, simple, and powerful faith. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, Let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." As soon as he had finished praying, the fire of the Lord fell from heaven. It was not a spark, but a consuming inferno. It burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and it even licked up the water that was in the trench. A supernatural fire had consumed a waterlogged offering, the very stones of the altar, and the dust beneath it. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate on the ground, their fear and awe erupting in a single, unified cry. "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." The tide had turned. The people's allegiance, so long divided, was now decisively for the Lord. Elijah seized the moment. "Seize the prophets of Baal," he commanded. "Don't let a single one get away." The people, newly emboldened, captured all 450 prophets. Elijah brought them down to the Kishon Brook, which ran at the foot of the mountain. And there, in a grim act of judgment prescribed by the law for those who led Israel astray, he executed them. The spiritual cancer had been excised, but the ordeal was not yet over. The judgment had come, but the promised blessing of rain had not. Elijah said to King Ahab, "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." While Ahab went off to feast, Elijah climbed to the very top of Mount Carmel, bent down to the ground, and put his face between his knees in a posture of intense, travailing prayer. He said to his servant, "Go and look toward the sea." The servant went, looked, and returned. "There is nothing," he reported. 7 times, Elijah sent his servant back. 7 times, he remained in fervent prayer. On the 7th time, the servant returned with a sliver of hope. "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." That was enough. "Go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you," Elijah commanded. In a short time, the sky that had been clear and hard for 3.5 years grew black with clouds. The wind rose, and a heavy rain began to fall. The land, so long parched and thirsty, began to drink in the life-giving water. Ahab rode his chariot toward his palace in Jezreel, and in a final display of divine power, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Elijah. He tucked his cloak into his belt and ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to the gates of the city, outrunning the king's horses as the storm of God's blessing washed the land clean. The silence of the idols had been answered by the fire and the reign of the one true God. The persecutors rode, and the light from heaven, in the volatile aftermath of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the city of Jerusalem simmered with a new and fervent faith. A small, devoted sect, known as followers of the Way, proclaimed a radical message. Their crucified teacher was the risen Messiah, the Son of God. This nascent movement, born in the crucible of grief and wonder, began to grow with astonishing speed, its message echoing through the temple courts and synagogues. But with this growth came friction, and soon the friction ignited into a raging fire of persecution. At the very heart of this fire, holding the bellows and breathing out murderous threats, was a man of brilliant mind, unshakable conviction, and terrifying zeal. His name was Saul of Tarsus, and he had become the chief hammer of the fledgling church, the unlikeliest candidate imaginable to become its greatest champion. This is his story, the story of a dramatic, blinding encounter on a dusty road that would transform the faith's most feared enemy into its most ardent and influential apostle. Saul was a man of impeccable pedigree, a Hebrew of Hebrews. Born in the cosmopolitan city of Tarsus, he was a citizen of Rome by birth, a privilege that afforded him status and protection throughout the empire. Yet his heart and soul belonged to Jerusalem and the strict traditions of his ancestors. He was a Pharisee, a member of the most rigorous and respected sect of Judaism, and he had studied at the feet of the renowned Rabbi Gamaliel. His intellect was sharp. His knowledge of the law was encyclopedic, and his passion for the purity of his faith was absolute. It was this very passion that fueled his rage against the followers of Jesus. To Saul, their message was not just wrong, it was a grotesque blasphemy. The claim that a man who had been executed as a common criminal under a Roman curse could be the long-awaited Messiah was an abhorrent corruption of everything he held sacred. He saw this new way as a cancerous growth on the body of Judaism, a heresy that had to be excised with surgical, even brutal precision. His first major appearance in the biblical narrative is a chilling one. He is a silent but approving observer at the martyrdom of Stephen, the first Christian to be killed for his faith. As Stephen, his face like an angel's, delivered a fiery sermon that condemned the religious establishment, the fury of the Sanhedrin boiled over. They dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. The men who cast the first stones laid their cloaks at the feet of a young man named Saul. He stood guard over their garments, his heart consenting to the brutal execution, his mind convinced that this was a righteous and necessary act. Stephen's death, however, did not quell the movement. It scattered it like embers from a fire. Believers fled Jerusalem, carrying their message to Judea, Samaria, and beyond. But for Saul, this was not enough. The persecution became his personal crusade. He was not a passive observer. He was the driving force, a whirlwind of religious fury. He went from house to house in Jerusalem, dragging men and women alike from their homes, committing them to prison, and seeking to force them to blaspheme the name of Jesus. He was, by his own later admission, a man insanely angry with the saints. His zeal, however, could not be contained by the borders of Judea. He learned that the Christian heresy had taken root in the ancient city of Damascus, a major hub of trade and culture some 150 miles to the north. The idea that this faith was spreading was intolerable to him. He went to the high priest in Jerusalem and requested formal letters of extradition addressed to the synagogues in Damascus. These letters would grant him the authority to arrest any followers of the way he found there, bind them, and bring them back to Jerusalem for trial and punishment. With the official documents in hand, he set off on the week-long journey, his heart set on his mission, convinced that he was doing the work of God. The road to Damascus was long and dusty. Saul and his companions traveled under the Syrian sun, their minds fixed on the task ahead. For Saul, every step was a step toward vindicating God's honor. He likely rehearsed the arguments he would use, the legal authority he possessed, and the satisfaction he would feel in stamping out this dangerous sect. He was the guardian of orthodoxy, the protector of the faith of his fathers, a righteous hammer poised to strike. As they neared the city around noon, when the sun was at its zenith, the journey's mundane rhythm was shattered in an instant of terrifying, supernatural power. A light from heaven, a light far brighter than the scorching midday sun, flashed around Saul and his entourage. It was a blast of pure, uncreated brilliance that threw him to the ground, his senses overwhelmed, his body pinned to the earth by an invisible force. Then a voice spoke from the heart of the light, a voice that was not for the ears of his companions, but for his soul alone. It spoke in Hebrew, the language of his heart, with a question that cut through all his layers of religious certainty. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" The question was bewildering. Saul knew he was persecuting the followers of a dead man named Jesus. He was not persecuting a divine being. Lying in the dust, blinded by the light, he asked the most important question of his life. "Who are you, Lord?" The answer would obliterate his entire worldview, shattering the foundations of his life's purpose. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." In that one sentence, Saul's reality collapsed. The man he thought was a dead blasphemer was alive. He was glorified. He was divine. And most shockingly, this risen Lord identified himself so completely with his followers that to persecute them was to persecute him. Every prison door Saul had bolted, every chain he had fastened, every threat he had uttered against these humble believers had been a direct assault on their glorious, living Lord enthroned in heaven. His righteous crusade was, in fact, a war against God himself. Trembling and astonished, stripped of all his pride and certainty, he could only ask, "What shall I do, Lord?" The voice commanded him, "Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." Saul's companions stood speechless. They had heard the sound of a voice, but had seen no one. The light had faded, but for Saul the darkness remained. When he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. The man who had been so sure of his own spiritual vision was now physically blind. The great Pharisee, the zealous hunter, was now helpless as a child. His companions took him by the hand and led him the rest of the way into the city of Damascus. He entered the city not as a proud inquisitor with letters of authority, but as a blind, humbled, and broken man. For 3 days, Saul remained in a house on a street called Straight. He was completely blind, and in a state of profound shock and spiritual upheaval, he neither ate nor drank. Those 3 days of darkness were a tomb for his old life. He spent the time in prayer, the torrent of what he had seen and heard washing over him, reordering every fiber of his being. The persecutor was being undone, and the apostle was being formed in the silent darkness. Meanwhile, in that same city, there lived a disciple named Ananias. He was a devout man, highly respected by the Jewish community. The Lord spoke to him in a vision. "Ananias." "Yes, Lord," he answered. "Go to the house of Judas on Straight Street and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul, for he is praying. In a vision, he has seen a man named Ananias come and place his hands on him to restore his sight." The command filled Ananias with terror. He knew Saul by his fearsome reputation. "Lord," he argued, his human fear overriding his initial obedience, "I have heard many reports about this man and all the harm he has done to your holy people in Jerusalem. And he has come here with authority from the chief priests to arrest all who call on your name." But the Lord's reply was firm, revealing the astonishing scope of his sovereign plan. "Go. This man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings, and to the people of Israel. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name." Reassured by this divine mandate, Ananias overcame his fear and obeyed. He found the house and went to Saul. Placing his hands on the blind man, he spoke words of brotherhood and healing. "Brother Saul," he began, the word itself a miracle, addressed from a disciple to the chief persecutor, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you were coming here, has sent me so that you may see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit." Instantly, something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he could see again. The physical healing was a powerful symbol of his spiritual illumination. The blindness that had represented his arrogant ignorance was gone, replaced by a new sight, a new understanding. He got up and was baptized, publicly identifying himself with the very people he had come to destroy. After 3 days of fasting, he took some food and regained his strength. Saul's transformation was not only internal and instantaneous, but its outward expression was immediate and shocking. He spent several days with the disciples in Damascus, the very people he had intended to drag back to Jerusalem in chains. And then he did the unthinkable. He went into the very synagogues where he was supposed to present his letters of arrest and began to preach. And his message was the most astounding proclamation they could imagine. Jesus is the Son of God. The Jews in Damascus were utterly bewildered. "Isn't he the man who raised havoc in Jerusalem among those who call on this name?" They whispered to one another. "And didn't he come here to take them as prisoners to the chief priests?" Saul, however, grew more and more powerful in his preaching. His brilliant mind, once used to refute the claims of Christ, was now a powerful tool to prove them. He marshaled the scriptures, his Pharisaical training giving him unparalleled insight, and systematically confounded the Jews living in Damascus. proving that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. His former allies were now his chief opponents. They could not win the argument, so they reverted to the same tactics Saul himself had once employed: violence. They conspired to kill him, watching the city gates day and night to prevent his escape. But the disciples learned of the plot. The hunter had become the hunted. In a stunning reversal of his proud arrival, Saul was forced to make a humble and ignominious escape. His new brothers in Christ took him by night and lowered him in a large basket through an opening in the city wall. The great Saul of Tarsus, the zealous persecutor, slipped away into the darkness, not as a failure, but as a newborn apostle, his old life left behind, his new life of suffering and service for the name of Jesus just beginning. The light on the road to Damascus had not just stopped a persecutor. It had ignited a fire that would carry the gospel to the ends of the earth. The beloved friend and the voice that woke the dead. In the final, tense months of Jesus' earthly ministry, the shadow of the cross loomed ever larger. The whispers of the religious authorities in Jerusalem had grown into open hostility, their plots hardening into a firm resolve to silence the Galilean teacher who so threatened their established order. In this climate of rising danger, the small village of Bethany, nestled on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives, was a sanctuary for Jesus. It was a place of refuge and rest, not because of its location, but because of a home that was always open to him, the home of 3 siblings whom he loved: Martha, Mary, and their brother, Lazarus. This is the story of that home, a place of ordinary friendship that would become the stage for the most extraordinary of Jesus' signs. It is a story of devastating grief, profound faith, and a voice that called a man back from the clutches of death. An act so powerful it would make Jesus' own death inevitable. The home in Bethany was one of textured personalities. Martha was practical and diligent, a woman whose love was expressed in ceaseless service and careful preparation. Her sister, Mary, was contemplative and devotional, the one who had once sat at Jesus' feet, hanging on his every word, choosing what he called the better part. And there was Lazarus, their brother, perhaps the quietest of the 3 in the gospel narrative, but one whom the scriptures simply state Jesus loved. Their friendship was a source of comfort and normalcy for a man whose life was anything but normal. One day, this haven of peace was shattered by sickness. Lazarus fell gravely ill. As his condition worsened, a chilling fear crept into the house. The sisters, having exhausted all earthly remedies, sent a messenger on the day-long journey to find Jesus, who was teaching beyond the Jordan River. Their message was a model of simple, trusting faith. It was not a demand or even a direct request. It simply said, "Lord, the one you love is sick." They knew it was enough. Their confidence in his power and his affection for their brother was absolute. When the message reached Jesus, his response was enigmatic, almost confounding. He looked at the anxious messenger and the concerned disciples around him and said, This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. It was a statement that seemed to promise a swift recovery. Yet, what he did next was even more perplexing. Instead of rushing to the side of his beloved friend, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. He deliberately delayed. In the space of this intentional pause, in the gap between the desperate plea and the divine response, the tragedy in Bethany would be allowed to run its full course. After 2 days had passed, Jesus turned to his disciples and announced, "Let us go back to Judea." His disciples were aghast. Judea was a death trap. "But Rabbi," they protested, their voices edged with fear, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back." Their fear was logical, born of a genuine concern for his safety. Jesus answered them with a gentle metaphor. "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light in them." He was telling them that his time, ordained by his Father, was not yet over. He was walking in God's will, and as long as he did, he was perfectly safe. He then returned to the matter at hand. "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep," he said, "but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples, still thinking in purely natural terms, misunderstood him completely. "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better," they reasoned, relieved. They thought Jesus was speaking of ordinary rest, a good sign of recovery. Jesus, seeing their incomprehension, had to speak plainly, dropping the metaphor for a stark and stunning reality. "Lazarus is dead," he told them. And then he added a statement that must have shocked them to the core. "And for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." The disciples were silent, trying to process this strange gladness in the face of his friend's death. It was Thomas, ever the pragmatist tinged with pessimism, who finally broke the silence. Resigning himself to what he saw as a fatalistic journey, he said to the others, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." When Jesus and his disciples finally arrived in the vicinity of Bethany, the air was thick with the sorrow of a community in mourning. The funeral had already taken place. Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. In the warm climate of Judea, this was significant. It meant that death was not just a certainty, but that the process of decay was already well underway, a grim reality that would later surface. Many Jews from Jerusalem had come out to comfort Mary and Martha, and the house was filled with the sounds of weeping. Martha, ever the active one, heard that Jesus was approaching the village and immediately went out to meet him on the road, leaving Mary in the house with the other mourners. When she reached Jesus, the grief and confusion of the past few days spilled out of her. "Lord," she said, the words a torrent of faith and pain, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." It was a statement of profound trust in his power, yet underscored by the heartbreaking reality of his absence. But even in her grief, a flicker of hope remained. "But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus looked at her, his heart moved by her struggling faith, and made one of the most powerful and self-revelatory statements of his entire ministry. "Your brother will rise again," he said. Martha, thinking in terms of conventional theology, replied, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." She affirmed her belief in the future hope of all believers, but it was a distant, abstract comfort. Jesus gently brought that future hope into the immediate present, into his own person. "I am the resurrection and the life," he declared. "The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Do you believe this? It was a direct question, a call for a personal faith that went beyond theological doctrine. And Martha, in a moment of stunning clarity amidst her grief, responded with a great confession, a parallel to Peter's own. "Yes, Lord," she said, "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." Having made her confession, she hurried back to the house and whispered privately to her sister, "The teacher is here and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went out to him. The Jews who were with her in the house, comforting her, assumed she was going to the tomb to weep there, and they followed her. Mary's encounter with Jesus was different from Martha's. She fell at his feet, her grief raw and unfiltered. She did not engage in theological dialogue. She simply wept and repeated the same heartbroken refrain as her sister. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and saw the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, his own emotions were profoundly stirred. The Greek text says he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. It was a reaction of deep anger and frustration at the brutal dominion of death, at the pain it inflicted upon the people he loved. "Where have you laid him?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. As they walked toward the tomb, Jesus wept. His were not the silent tears of stoic grief, but the open, unrestrained sobs of a man whose heart was breaking. The shortest verse in the English Bible contains an ocean of theological truth. It reveals the profound humanity of the Son of God, his capacity for deep friendship, and his empathy with human suffering. The Jews who saw it remarked, "See how he loved him." But others, more cynical, whispered, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" They came to the tomb. It was a cave cut into the rock, with a large stone laid across the entrance. Jesus, his face still set with a mixture of sorrow and a powerful resolve, gave a command that shocked everyone. "Take away the stone." It was the practical Martha who immediately protested, her mind snapping to the grim, physical reality of the situation. "But Lord," she said, her voice filled with alarm, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." She was trying to protect him and everyone else from the horrifying smell of decomposition. Jesus looked at her, his voice gentle but firm, reminding her of his promise. "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God." Humbled, Martha fell silent. The men, with some effort, rolled the heavy stone away from the mouth of the tomb, revealing a dark, cold opening. The moment was thick with a tense, expectant silence. Then Jesus looked up to heaven. He did not pray a prayer of petition, but one of thanksgiving, speaking aloud for the sake of the crowd, so they would know the power came from his Father. "Father," he said, "I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." After he had said this, he took a deep breath and shouted into the darkness of the tomb with a voice that was not a request, but a command, a voice of absolute authority over the forces of death itself. "Lazarus, come out." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, from the shadows of the tomb, a figure emerged. It was Lazarus. He was alive, but he was a terrifying sight, still bound hand and foot with the strips of linen burial cloths, his face wrapped in a separate cloth. He shuffled into the daylight, a man literally caught between the grave and new life. The crowd gasped, stumbling back in a mixture of terror and utter amazement. Jesus, seeing their stunned paralysis, gave a second, gentle command. "Take off the grave clothes," he said, "and let him go." His friends rushed forward, fumbling with the wrappings, unbinding the man who was dead and was now alive again. They were not just removing his grave clothes, they were participating in his liberation, a living parable of the freedom from death that Jesus had come to bring. The miracle was undeniable, public, and profoundly polarizing. The effect was twofold and immediate. Many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. They had witnessed the ultimate sign, the irrefutable proof of his claim to be the resurrection and the life. But some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. The news sent shockwaves through the religious establishment. This was not a subtle healing or a private miracle. It was a public resuscitation of a man 4 days dead. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, was convened in an emergency session. Their fear was palpable. "What are we accomplishing?" they asked one another. "Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation." It was Caiaphas, the high priest that year, who spoke with a cold, cynical pragmatism that he intended as political wisdom, but was, in fact, an unconscious prophecy. "You know nothing at all," he declared. "You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." With those words, the final official decision was made. The plot to kill Jesus was no longer a secret desire. It was a matter of state policy. The greatest act of life Jesus ever performed had sealed his own death warrant. He had called his friend out of a tomb, and in doing so, had ensured that he himself would soon be in one.